Good afternoon, everyone. Just wanted to run you through as quick as I can a kind of recap or kind of a my attempt at streamlining or making more clear all of the must-know Supreme Court cases that you will see on Friday's Open Notes quiz. So I'm going to go through each one. I'm going to ask that you have your packet out and that you're adding notes or clarifying anything that you weren't necessarily tracking as you were looking at OYES or any of the others. So the first thing we're going to look at here is McCulloch v. Maryland, right? And so McCulloch v. Maryland is a pretty foundational case up there with Marbury v. Madison as two of the most important cases really in our country's history that also were in the earliest years of our country. And so if you remember from other parts of our course, we talked about this case as being a case that did a lot of things. So let's recap. At issue, right, the essential story was that in pursuant of kind of regulating the national economy, Congress set up a national bank, right? And there was a charter issued in Baltimore to set up a physical location of the United States Bank in Baltimore. And so, as soon as that bank opened in Baltimore, Maryland, the state of Maryland came in and said, "We're going to tax you on this." The clerk in the national bank said, "Well, I'm not going to pay the tax. We're the federal government. Who do you think you are?" And the state sued McCulloch and basically said, "You have to pay the tax, right? And more so, right? We don't even think that you have the legitimacy to even have a national bank because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that." And so the two legal questions, quite simply, were could Congress charter a national bank even in the absence of that language in the Constitution? And second is can states tax a national bank? And not just a national bank, can states tax entities of the federal governments that exist in their states? So, two pretty big questions. And this decision was a unanimous one. And all the justices basically found that yes, right, that Congress could set up a national bank. And even though there isn't language in the Constitution that specifically says they could, right, there is wording in the Constitution that basically says Congress has all powers necessary, can use all powers necessary and proper in pursuant of their constitutional responsibilities. And so this came to be known as the Necessary Proper Clause, which was strengthened and really kind of highlighted in McCulloch v. Maryland. And from the Necessary and Proper Clause, suddenly, if Congress could do all things necessary and proper to accomplish their constitutional mandates, then there was a whole slew, thousands of other rights and powers that they had that weren't enumerated in the Constitution. So McCulloch v. Maryland also gave rise to implied powers, right? That Congress has more powers than only which are delegated to them or enumerated in the Constitution. Second, and perhaps just as important, they further clarified, right, the language of the Constitution, highlighting not just the Necessary and Proper Clause, but the part of the Constitution that says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And basically, all judges in every state, right, are basically bound to the Constitution as the supreme law of the land, right? And so state law, right, when it's in opposition to the Constitution, are going to always lose. The Constitution is supreme. Moving on, let's take a look at Gibbons v. Ogden, another case that I think exemplifies the fact that small little rinky-dink stories can form the backbone of really sacred law. And so in this case, you're talking about a ferry boat that kind of plied its waters back and forth between the states of New Jersey and New York, right? And so this ferry boat, right, which was operating under like waters that were moving beyond state borders, and so therefore are more accurately looked at as property of the federal government, right? Was it going to be New York that could supervise and exercise authority and regulate these ferry boat operations, or was that the domain of the federal government exclusively? And so the question, to rephrase it, is did the state of New York have authority, right, in a realm that may or may not be reserved exclusively to Congress. And so this ferry boat decision, this very basic ferry boat decision, ended up being a hugely important federalism case. Some might argue that Gibbons v. Ogden and the Commerce Clause it created was maybe the single biggest federalism case, because suddenly, right, the federal government's power over the states was strengthened enormously, right? Because that part of the Constitution where the Supreme Court pulled language directly from the Constitution that basically became known as the Commerce Clause. And that part is basically saying that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce, not the states. So New York, you're out of bounds, right? That ferry boat is on waters that pass between Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, and so that is clearly right federal, right, and goes between states, and because it goes between states, only Congress has that power. Now, what is the significance of this Commerce Clause? Did it only regulate ferry boats? No, right? The Commerce Clause has been used quite simply to justify the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of other bureaucracies where the federal government is now in charge with regulating, right? And so, Commerce Clause gives them the right to do the EPA. Commerce Clause gives them the right to set up OSHA. Commerce Clause gives them the right to set up U.S. Postal Service. Like a lot of different things were suddenly made clear in the Gibbons v. Ogden case because of the Commerce Clause that the opinion of the court strengthened. Moving on, we now have Dred Scott v. Sandford. This was a case, if you look at the date, 1857, just a couple years before the Civil War broke out. And for those of you who took U.S. history last year, you're going to hear some parallels. Background of the story is Dred Scott was born and lived in Illinois, which was a state under the Missouri Compromise where slavery was illegal. But later in his life, he was moved into Missouri where slavery was legal, and he was suddenly basically a slave again in the eyes of the law. And so Dred Scott sued for his freedom and arguing hey, I lived in Illinois, therefore I am not a slave, I am a free man. Slavery is illegal in that state. And basically the finding of this case, while historically important, is very depressing and ends up becoming less important because later cases have obviously relinquished or kind of erased some of these decisions. But the question of was Dred Scott free or a slave was the primary question that was seeking to be answered, but the decision that was reached for the court actually had far broader reaching ramifications that got at the power of people who weren't citizens to even invoke or use U.S. courts. And so the court basically said that slaves or anyone that could trace their ancestry back to slaves from Africa were therefore never citizens of the United States. And because they weren't citizens of the United States, they therefore didn't have the protections of Article 3 of the Constitution or any other parts. And so that was one part of the decision, that they lacked citizenship, and therefore who are you to use U.S. courts to sue? You're not a citizen. But second, it was also a case that could be argued was actually more states' rights oriented, because the decision by the court found that Congress lacked authority to forbid slavery in the first place. That basically any argument that the Constitution granted Congress the right to issue a Missouri Compromise and prohibit or allow slavery in certain states would have been outside of their scope of practice. They didn't have that powers, and so that power went back to the states. And I think you could argue Dred Scott v. Sandford was a federalism case, kind of moving in the opposite direction from Gibbons v. Ogden. Moving on, we have Plessy v. Ferguson, another case with later reaching civil rights implications dealing with issues of race in early America. And in this case, you started to see a lot of kind of the roads paved for Jim Crow laws and early, or not early, I guess, mid U.S. history laws dealing with segregation, right? In this case, you had the Louisiana Railroad that basically had cars on the railroad um, that were all white or all black, and basically mandating segregation on these railroad cars. And so um, they were sued. And basically, you can see this is post Civil War, and so slavery is now illegal, right? But if you were a African American citizen of this country, especially as of the 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendment, you are a citizen. Could you be restricted from accessing um, certain train cars or certain, you know, uh, water fountains or certain stores or certain whatever? Is that allowable? This question a little bit more simply, let's just say it what it is. Is Louisiana's law that allowed racial segregation on trains, is that running into direct opposition to the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment, which is pretty new and thus far untested? Basically, is segregation congruent with the 14th Amendment? And so I think in 2020, we look at it and say, no, right? But the court reached the decision in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson that segregation was allowable even with the 14th Amendment, so long as there were separate and, in their terms, equal, right, facilities. So you couldn't tell a slave that they couldn't use the train so long as there was a black train, right? If that was okay, then that was okay. You couldn't tell somebody you can't use this water fountain unless you were willing to put a water fountain right up next to it that was only for black folks, right? Like, so as long as you were creating separate spaces, then the finding in Plessy v. Ferguson was that separate but equal is a perfectly fine way of navigating around the equal protection wording of the 14th Amendment. And so Plessy v. Ferguson quite simply established the separate but equal philosophy, which was later overturned in Brown v. Board of Education. Moving on, let's take a look at let me see here. Let's take a look at Shank v. United States. Again, I think the dates of these are important. Shank v. United States, 1919. This is right after World War I, where people are, particularly in our country, still dealing with like the after effects of war nationalism. And so you had this guy by the name of Shank who started to basically release and I lectured on this last week, but started to release papers advocating for people to refuse to register for the military draft and to basically overthrow the United States government. And so was Shanks, I'm not going to go too long on this one because I already did it, but was Shank allowed to encourage his supporters not to do things that were fundamental parts of our country, and more so to advocate for the overthrow of our country? Was Shank's freedom of speech going to protect him there? And so in this case, right, you saw that the Shank decision kind of defined the limits of what the First Amendment freedom of speech really granted. And the decision was that free speech could be limited when there was a clear and present danger to national security. And so that becomes known as the clear and present danger test. If you are going to take away somebody's civil liberties, whether it's, their freedom of speech or the freedom of press, which we see in like prior restraint later, you damn well better be sure to argue that there is a clear and present danger to national security, right? And when that clear and present danger case is made in front of a court and the court buys that, then speech could be regulated, especially during times at war where the clear and present danger test may be a little bit lower. And so Shank was a case that kind of defined limits of freedom of speech and becomes like the foundation for other cases dealing with speech later on. Final case, we have Gitlow v. New York, and I'm kind of mixing these two, and that's my fault. I want to be clear here. All right, if Shank basically established the clear and present danger test of when you could limit speech, Gitlow, a couple years later, right, kind of took it a little further. And so, you can see here that New York had punished Benjamin Gitlow for advocating for the overthrow of the U.S. government, right? And basically, Gitlow sued New York and said, this is in violation of my due process clause. and the decision incorporated it.